we've invited 3 people to come and reflect on what Deanna has said and what and on the basis of their own experience. They're all 3 library directors. They're all 3 distinguished library directors. Gwen Bird, University Librarian and Dean of Libraries at Simon Fraser University. I'll invite Gwen to come up. Gwen is the newest member of CRL's Board of Directors. Susan Gibbons, University Librarian and Deputy Provost for Libraries and Scholarly Communications, Yale University, and also, just as of today, an outgoing member of CRL's Board of Directors. Susan put in her 6 years, and they were a good 6 years for CRL. And Virginia Steele, University Librarian at University of California, Los Angeles, and also a current member of the CRL Board of Directors. And Ginny was also just elected to the chair of OCLC's Global Council. Was that yesterday? Or the?
That was
yesterday. So Ginny has massive power.
If only.
Yeah. So what we'd like is we've asked Gwen and Susan and Ginny to just each individually speak for just a few minutes on what kinds of thoughts Deanna's remarks raised for them and what they think about the challenges. So we go in alphabetical order.
Thank you, Deanna, for a high-level and historic overview of the topic and for your compelling call to action. My remarks will bring the focus down to the institutional level. I'm asking what the appropriate role for the individual research library is in light of the collective action that is so obviously needed. And my comments will also be distinguished from the other panelists based on 3 defining characteristics of my home institution, Simon Fraser University. First, my institution is young. Second, it is not large. And third, it is Canadian. Simon Fraser University was founded in 1965 and thus has just celebrated its 50th anniversary. It's a comprehensive university in Vancouver, Canada, just across town from the University of British Columbia, a larger ARL library which has older, deeper collections and very recently opened a brand new high-density storage facility. Ingrid? Given all this, it occurs to me that I could just rely on my neighbors and throw up my hands and say there's really no role for us here. And while this is a little bit tempting, it's actually not the case. In fact, I see that even as a young, mid-sized library, we can have a significant role in the long-term preservation of print collections. How do we do this? First, we are having active conversations within our library and on our campus about collective collections. We're very deliberately talking about the way that the significant body of electronic text now available to scholars is raising the locus of management for collections above the institutional level, as Constance Malpas puts it. For some time now at Simon Fraser, we have not been making local collections decisions based solely on what we purchase, what we own, and what we retain. Instead, we're triangulating these decisions with information about our digital holdings and our own digital preservation program. We're also actively participating in a shared print program coordinated by our regional consortium, the Council of Prairie and Pacific University Libraries, COPL, and its shared print archive network. We've made retention commitments and withdrawal decisions based on that program. We are willing to put the substantial staff resources into upgrading records to expose our retention commitments as part of our participation in the program. And we're also willing to take the time required to send staff to the shelf to validate holdings, because we recognize that these efforts on our part are the price of admission into the collaborative collections management arena. This shared print initiative within COPL is funded on a member pay basis, with the largest institutions in the group contributing fewer financial resources in recognition of their larger role in archiving and retaining more volumes. So for my mid-sized library, in addition to retaining some serial runs, upgrading records, and validating holdings, we're also willing to commit financial resources to offset the cost of storage at the largest libraries. The library at Simon Fraser has spent 50 years amassing about 3 million print volumes, And while these collections serve local teaching and research needs well, we've not necessarily been thinking during these first 50 years about preservation over the long term, nor necessarily about our unique contribution to a national or international preservation collection. I think of this now as a coming of age for my library, a moment of maturity and acceptance of the critical historical imperative of our profession to steward and preserve the scholarly record. Thus, we now have construction underway on our campus for additional climate-controlled and access-controlled storage. In the first instance, this is to house our unique, rare, and archival collections, but it is also in part to house the volumes we've committed to retain as part of the shared print initiative and to store them in an appropriate preservation environment. As Bernie mentioned, the Paper 2 Summit in Berkeley last June was a real reality check against the optimism and local activity of shared print programs. There, I was sobered by the statistics on just how little of the cumulative print corpus we have covered in our shared print programs to date. It's encouraging that shared print initiatives are now aggregating with meta-level agreements between groups. But what we learned in Berkeley is that, in fact, these well-intentioned efforts are so ad hoc that they're barely making a dent. Despite the valiant efforts by the many libraries and consortia participating in these initiatives, only some 11% of the total 470,000 serial titles in ULRICs have been archived, let alone the larger group that Bernie outlined in his opening remarks. If more have been archived or preserved within regional or institutional programs, they've not been reported in ways that we can register. And further, many of these efforts, including the regional one in which my own library participates, has dual goals of space saving on local campuses and preservation. So many of the titles that are deemed to be lower risk are archived in place, some in open stacks, and they're not fully meeting the kind of preservation goals that Deanna so clearly delineated in her keynote. My institution's role in collaborative print preservation efforts is also influenced by the fact that it is Canadian. The U.S. national focus reflected in Deanna's history of collective efforts is mirrored north of the 49th parallel by a similar saga, frankly no less discouraging. The legislated mandate of Librarian Archives Canada as the national library is to preserve the documentary heritage of Canada for the benefit of present and future generations, and also to facilitate in Canada cooperation among communities involved in the acquisition, preservation, and diffusion of knowledge. So in keeping with its preservation mandate, Librarian Archives Canada is now leading a national effort they are calling their Last Copy Initiative. In 2013, LAC approved a policy for management of last copies to which they now adhere and which they are working to expand into a national network across Canada. This will knit together regional efforts across the country, including COPL's Shared Print Initiative, the Downsview 5, and work within the Ontario Council of University Libraries, among others. There's a will to cooperate, and solid leadership will help as we build the trust relationships that are so crucial to this work. The developments at Librarian Archives Canada have been slightly slowed by delays in their platform procurement process for a new catalog and national union database. Plans are in place for a comprehensive overlap study to take the measure of major research collections in Canada and to have participating institutions follow a set of principles like those articulated in their Last Copy Initiative. Working with the Canadian Association of Research Libraries and with CRL, they intend to share the resulting data set to determine the optimal number of copies to be preserved for all material published in Canada. As I mentioned when I opened, it might first appear that a young mid-sized Canadian research library has little to contribute to large-scale print preservation efforts, but I find there are numerous significant ways that we can participate. I'm aware this is an effort for the ages, and as Deanna has so eloquently reminded us, it's one with very high stakes. And with that, I'll pass it over to Susan.
Good afternoon. I wanted to talk a little bit about what it means to be a library of record and what our role is in this world of preservation. First of all, the sense of being a library of record, I don't think libraries actually raise their hands and say we want to be one. Rather, it is a label that is foisted upon you, and it is this presumed that you are then a library of record. We do think of ourselves in that role, but not about our new collections, not about the collections that we're purchasing today. We think of it only in the role of the collections that we already have and what we do with the collections that we have. So we keep a copy of everything. We do not toss unless we have duplicate copies. We do not toss unless we see at least 26 other copies out there in the world if our copy happens to be quite brittle or something like that. So we behave in that way. But in terms of purchasing going forward, that is not how we make our purchasing decisions. Today, about 65% of our purchases, excluding special collections, are in digital formats, of which most of it is licensed. So if everyone's relying on us to be buying all those books, we have a problem right there. So we have a high-density storage facility. We're quite fortunate to have that. Today, about 7.1 million volumes out of our 15 million are in our high-density storage facility. The operating costs for that facility are approximately $1.5 million per year. That's the operating costs and staffing. And then we have electricity. That varies from year to year, can buy hundreds of thousands of dollars. But we are striving to keep the temperature at 50 degrees, and the humidity at 40%. Then we have our preservation conservation staff who work with us, and that's several million. So many millions are being spent every year at Yale, and it falls far, far short from what is needed for our collection. We cannot keep up with the preservation needs of our collections. We're making trade-offs every single year. Now, when you think about it, that high-density storage facility, less than 1.5% of the total volumes in the facility are used in a given year. Now, if you run a high-density storage facility, that's terrific. That means you pick the right volumes. If you have 10% or 20%, you're spending a lot of costs and you pick the wrong volumes to put in storage. But imagine it from the other side, when you're talking to those who fund you and you explain the return on investment. Here is a facility of which only 1.5% of what's in there is used in a given year. I'm very fortunate to work at an institution that understands why we must do this. And we have space to grow. We have 3 more modules that we can put materials into. But we will run out of space in our current storage facility, and we will be faced with an 8-figure, meaning tens of millions of dollars it will cost to build the next high-density storage facility, let alone the land costs, the loss of opportunity of that land, and then the local politics of getting building permits and all of that. It will be extremely expensive. I worry about that day where I go before the university and say, I need 8 figures to continue to create a storage facility for materials of which less than 1.5% a year will get used. That is a very hard argument to make, and Harvard and others are facing this same discussion today. So we are at risk, and I think we have to really consider that and the importance of collective action, because we can't rely on the largest universities to continue down this path. So as we're running out of space, what could happen? Well, one thing we might be forced is to change the criteria for what we put in storage. We might have to put less in there to try to slow down that pace. We're sort of inching towards this right now. The 13 libraries that make up the IV+, we are in the process, we're at the final stages of hiring a director for collection initiatives. What we would like is for this individual to help think cooperatively across the 13 institutions of different collection projects, one of which we want to consider is shared print retention. In other words, do we all have to put the same volumes into our high-density storage facilities? Now, from a group of 13, this makes a lot of sense. This will help slow down how we fill up our storage facilities. But when you think of it as the ecosystem of a national or international system, that means fewer copies are actually going to get preserved. So our local decisions of a group of 13 might actually have detrimental effects on the rest. If you're hoping that the 13 of us would have always kept all of our copies, assume 13 copies are going into high density. That might not happen if we follow down this pathway. So how can we react unless we know what the national and the international strategies are going to be to make sure our decisions are aligned with them and not counter to them? We don't see it emerging yet, so we have to, by default, make the decisions that are best for our group. Will it force us someday to rethink our ILL fees? Do we have to push the costs that we are carrying for all of this material to the rest, through our partners, through additional subsidies, such as ILL fees? I hope not, but it's not out of the possibility. We participated in the Brittle Book Program that Deanna talked about. RLG was the organizer for us, and tens of thousands of books were microfilmed through the Brittle Book Program. Just recently, we were contacted by OCLC, which RLG became a part of, and told that all of those preservation microfilms that RLG committed to take care of for us, it's no longer in their business interest. And they're going to ship them. We have to find something else to do with them. So we either have to ship them back to Yale. You don't want your preservation copies with your access copies. We're struggling to figure out what to do with this. And so it's sort of a lesson learned, or twice over lesson learned. One is no good deed goes unpunished. But the second is preservation is a long-term commitment. And we have to be very, very careful on the partners that we pick up in this journey, because RLG at the time seemed like the right partner. Several decades later, that turned out to be the wrong decision. So I want to end, not to say that, what I don't want the message to be is a sort of this crying poor. We certainly see a responsibility that we have. We recognize we are very well resourced, and therefore we want to be part of a national strategy. But the challenge is greater than the resources of one library. The challenge is greater than the combined resources of the wealthiest libraries around. It is a challenge that we all must face together. And Deanna's story tells us we keep trying, and each time we fail. We are really at a precipice of some hard decisions for all of us. And hopefully, it is conversations like this that will help us find some new solutions. Thank you.
Always the delicate dance on these. Yes. So thank you, Deanna, also for your wonderfully thought-provoking keynote. I'm going to speak more from the space perspective, which is heavily influencing how we deal with our collections at UCLA. UCLA does consider itself a collection of record, even though we're not as old as Yale. But we have about 12 million volumes in our collections. We have 8 libraries on campus. Each of those libraries is full. And we are still buying considerable quantities of print materials. We are buying print that we are sending to storage as soon as we receive it. So for us, our legacy collections start today. We don't think about what we used to have and our older materials as being the ones that we have to worry about. We think of our whole print corpus as something that is of concern to us. Where are we going to put it, and how are we going to make sure that it continues to be in good condition and accessible to our users? So compounding our space situation is the fact that UCLA has the largest student enrollment in the University of California system, but the smallest geographic footprint of any of the campuses. So that you can imagine that the pressure for space and the politicking that goes on around space at UCLA is intense. Practically every conversation I go to with other deans in some way touches on the space we have. There isn't enough space for classrooms, there aren't enough laboratories, there aren't enough offices, and there isn't enough library space. And in fact, over the last several decades, UCLA has lost library space as academic libraries have taken some of the real estate that we used to have. And that means, again, we have to come up with a solution for what we do with those materials. So in the UC system, in the 1970s, there was a master plan that was done that called for the establishment of regional storage facilities, which I'm sure most, if not all of you know about. There's one in the north on the Richmond campus that Berkeley controls, and there's one in the south on the UCLA campus. Those opened in the 1980s. NRLF has had 2 additional modules added, and SRLF has had 1 more module added. Both of those facilities will be full in 2019. The UC system, the 10 campus libraries store 300,000 volumes a year, and we expect that that rate will continue because, again, we're not out of the print business. We're still very much invested in buying print. So we're in the midst of trying to figure out how to deal with our collections and the growing need for additional space for them. We've tried to use the regional library facilities as strategically as we can. At the Southern Regional Library Facility, we house the JSTOR print archive, which was a project that we undertook some years ago and where we're doing page-level validation of the journals and really trying to ensure that we are building a print archive that is really going to contain everything that we think it does. One of the interesting facets of doing that work is that we discovered that the collections of journals that we deposited from UCLA were actually probably in the worst condition because they'd been the most heavily used. And the ones that turned out to be in the best condition were from some of the newer, younger UC campuses that hadn't had as much intensive use. And in general, at UCLA, our collections are very heavily used, so we find in going up to the stacks and even pulling a random item off the shelf, it's rare to find one that doesn't have extensive highlighting, a lot of underlining, and all those comments in the margin, some of which are quite fascinating to read. So we have been talking as a UC system about how best to deal with our space issues and our long-term preservation commitment to our collections. We have persistence policies that mandate us to deposit things into our storage facilities knowing that they will remain there. And we also have non-duplication policies. So if an item is already in one of the regional facilities, a campus is not allowed to deposit another copy. But still, we're running out of space. We've tried to think about other kinds of alternatives, such as belonging to West and other kinds of shared print archiving strategies, but that's not enough. We've thought about the third-party option, using a vendor, and actually Susan's story is a cautionary tale because we never know. A third-party vendor can go out of business or change their business strategies quite rapidly, and that will leave us high and dry. And in fact, what we've learned in talking with people is they often make it easy and attractive to deposit materials, but then getting them out, withdrawing them, or dealing with a crisis situation is very difficult. So time is of the essence for us, and we believe that we need to change the narrative. We need to talk with our faculty about the fact that we need to build our collections and take care of our collections in a way that makes them sustainable and that conserves them for many years to come. We need to figure out cost and governance models. We need to figure out what kind of preservation needs to be done, what are the priorities for that, and we need to manage the risk. How many copies do we need within the UC system, regionally, nationally, internationally? We need to strengthen our culture of collaboration. We need firm institutional commitments with coordination around governance structures. We need to think, are we going to be a federation or are we going to be a series of fragmented shared print activities? So I'm really optimistic about the meeting here. I know we've heard from Deanna that it's really tough to have something come out, no matter how willing people are to engage in the discussion, but I think the time is upon us, and we really must deal with this. So thank you.
Thank you, Ginny, and Susan and Gwen. Three different perspectives from very different kinds of organizations. It's interesting the perspective of the young institution, young smaller institution, but stepping up to the challenge. We do have some time for your thoughts, for hearing your thoughts on the comments that you've heard and the perspectives that you heard in the last few minutes. And so, if you would like to speak up, make your thoughts known. There's somebody with a microphone who will be relatively close to you. Please remember to say your name and where you're from.
Any questions for Deanna as well?
I guess we can entertain questions for Deanna as well. Yep. If that's all right with Deanna. I think we have to we have to modify her contract now. Or talk to her agent.
Hi, thank you all. I don't know if this is a question, but one thing. I'm Carla Strebe. I'm at the Ohio State University Libraries, and I'm the Assistant Director for Collections, Tech Services, and Scholarly Communication. And now we don't have any time for my question. So one thing that strikes me is how hard it is in this space to, in some ways, define success. And I'm thinking about, in some, just one example of that is Susan's story, where after, 30 years maybe, partner came back and says, we're not able to fulfill our stewardship role, we're giving back to you. When you first started telling that story, I thought, oh, she's going to say that they can't find him anymore. That would have been failure. I think it does raise this interesting question of, well, they took care of him for 30 years, and they're still there at least to hand back. And while that's not ideal, from where we sit today, if we could be confident that in 30 years, many of the things we're talking about that we're concerned about would be there for us to come together in a room and talk about what do we do with them for the next 30 years, that might be success, actually. So I think it is something for us to think about as we try to make progress. And even listening to Deanna's history, despite the hemming and hawing and lack of, quote, progress, how much has really disappeared from those collections in that time interval? I don't know, and I don't know if it's knowable. So I guess I just kind of throw that out maybe for you guys to react to, of what thoughts you have about how we might productively think about success in a way that enables us to move forward, as opposed to just castigating ourselves and reflecting on our many failures, and way things haven't worked the way we expected.
Yeah. I would say one thing that we try to talk about when we think about preservation is all we can do is pass our collections to the next generation. That's as far as we can possibly think, and it helps to sort of ratchet back some of our expectations, but also our hysteria that we're going to fail on this. So what can we do to get it to the next generation? So yes, the preservation microfilm was in a salt mine. Presumably when we go to the salt mine, it's still going to be there, and we can pull it out. But it was sort of a surprise to know that you have to revisit that question. But to your point, today we might be able to digitize that microfilm and make it more accessible. I don't know. It gives us a chance to also look at use over time. But it is that, I think to your point, success perhaps can only be measured in these smaller increments of we did the best we can today, and we have a full collection to hand to the next generation to carry from there.
Scott Walter, here.
So
Your microphone is coming. Scott Walter from DePaul University.
Yeah, I appreciate the intro. I was intrigued, I guess, by Susan's comment about going to the board and saying, and I was thinking about that 1.5%, and I was thinking about the Field Museum here in Chicago, and I know that it's a very small percentage of their overall collections that we ever get to see. I don't remember what the number is. It's in the 10 or 12% of what you actually see when you walk through. And it just struck me that what we're talking about here, maybe we need to begin to frame the challenge, in a way that's not just about the future of print and so on. It's really about the public good. It's our moonshot, right? Isn't that where we are? It's our moonshot. It's Joe Biden curing cancer. It's how are we going to deal with this problem that is really a national, even an international problem, if we want to make good on a commitment to ongoing access to the materials of our cultural heritage. And that is a challenge not just for us in terms of space, it's a challenge for the museum community, which also has space issues. It's a challenge across the cultural heritage sector. And living in Illinois, I know that appeals to the common good only get you so far down the street. But it's a different way of posing the problem and bringing the potential stakeholders together who might be able to help us to address it. So that was just my reflection. I don't know if you think that's in any way a useful way of thinking about it.
It is useful, and it's even more powerful if in saying, in appealing to the common good, we can then show a common strategy of which our participation in something much greater, as opposed to we need to do this because nobody else is kind of thing. And so it is extremely powerful, and I imagine it will resonate with those who I would have to make this argument to, but boy, I'd have a lot more success, I think, if I can show this is one crucial piece to a much larger system that we are all a part of and are all fully participating in.
I would also add to that, I think that there's so much talk these days about taking care of the planet and trying to make sure that the planet will be around. We need to relate to that and say this truly is our cultural heritage. It's not only libraries, it is museums, as you point out, and other kinds of institutions. And if we can make that something that seems urgent and a high priority for the larger community, I think there will be more understanding of the fact that there will be costs involved. It's not necessarily something that's going to be solved very simply at no cost, but it is something that we need to attend to.
I was struck by Carla Streeb's comment about information about, do we know what the losses are? Every once in a while, someone like Nicholson Baker comes along to remind us what the losses are, or at least to try to tell us what the losses are. That was a real moment in 2000 or 2001 when Nicholson Baker published his Double Fold. And so you get anecdotal data like that. He did not do a systematic check or analysis of what's lost versus what was saved, but he was able to, identify enough problems that we know they're there. That's a kind of data, though, it's very difficult to get if you're on the inside, and it's a very difficult kind of data for libraries to disclose. Nobody wants to disclose what they've lost. Nobody wants to disclose that there are art or colored plate books in their collection, folio colored plate books in their collections that no longer have the plates anymore. But I think we're at the point where we're going to have to start disclosing, at least within the community. Otherwise, you get interlopers like Nicholson Baker come and say, they did it, and there was some value that we have actually had. CRL has been collecting a lot of data about archive holdings, and it is very difficult data to get at any granular level. It's the reporting of holdings information has historically not been full. It's very labor intensive, it's time consuming, and in many cases what you learn when you do that, when you collect that kind of data, is something you don't want to know. And so there are all kinds of disincentives for it. But I think it's time that we get down to a more granular level on it. We've started exposing some profiles of the archive programs. And these are things we started exposing profile of CRL CRL's JSTOR, and then we did Linda Hall and a couple of the others. And it was interesting. Most of what we found was self-disclosed, but not all self-disclosed in one place. And so one of the things the Committee on the Future of Print looked at when we were planning this was, we looked at those profiles and I said, how useful are these? These are this particular archiving program, CRL, JSTOR program. This is the level of validation. This is what's standing in the way of collections being disposed of or not disposed of. This is what the terms of commitment are for it. This is the growth in it over time, that kind of thing. And I think the sense of the group was that it was useful information, but it needs to be much more codified and structured to be able to be, these profiles, you can see them, they're on the web. We'll give you links to them later on. It's a lot of reading, frankly, and time is effort these days. So, anyhow, there's a question in the back here. Brian Schottlander
from UC San Diego. So you kicked us off, Bernie, with the following statement. This is about, and I noticed this particularly, this is about a generational turn. I would suggest it's actually not about a generational turn. It's about generational turn, period. So the fact that preservation initiatives like West think in terms of 25 years is not coincidence. It is, to Susan's point, about getting things to the next generation. Why is that important? Because preservation isn't one and done. So when Warren Haas says it's the great forgotten problem of our age, it's the problem we want to forget. We want to be able to say we've done it, but you've never done it because rust never sleeps. So anyone who deludes themselves, and I'm sorry that Susan had to be shocked into that aha moment by RLG saying, hey, the microfilm we've been keeping for 30 years, guess what? It ain't part of our business plan anymore. Well, at least the aha moment came eventually, because that's just going to keep happening over and over and over again. It's the problem of our age and the problem that will never go away.
Good one. Martha Ruska, friend here.
Can I just talk?
Sorry. There you go.
So, building on that, and just maybe on what Deanna was talking about as well, do we need to do more about really solidifying the governance, the agreements about, is it enough? I know in West we'll have like 25-year agreements or something like that. Is that, and do we consistently apply those and have them out there that they are for 25 or 30 years? And especially, I guess the other part of my question is, in some ways, for all of our institutions, this is a bit of an unfunded mandate that we put on ourselves because I don't know that our parent institutions necessarily always quite grasp the problem in terms of the funding need that's there. So I'm just kind of struggling with how we make sure that is part of the funding that's required for our libraries to kind of continue to be part of this, and that there's an interdependent kind of network. I think we get it, but I'm not always sure that the parent university institutions get that, and that maybe having those better, written up and solidified, or
the narrative.
Get that narrative out there on a broad institutional level.
I think it's part of our obligation. I mean, in a way, it's part of stewardship is crafting the narrative. It's doing the work, but it's also convincing the parties that they need to, that it's part of the university's mandate or the library's mandate. It seems to me, you're right, the funding is not there for the most part, but it's got to come. And part of it is funding, part of it is ingenuity, seems to me, too. I think we have time for one more.
Could I just say something? I also think we need to make it real for our parent institutions and our faculty and all of our constituents. I remember when Susan's predecessor, Rudy Rogers, did the Slow Fires video that was so popular in, what, the 80s, where he took a book off the Yale shelf and he opened it and then just blew the bits of paper away, because that's how that collection was. And that generated a lot of talk at that time. But I can't think of anything that has been done that really illustrates the problem we're facing as effectively. And so, in a sense, I think there's almost a need for PR with our parent institutions, especially our funders, to say, look, this is what's happening. This is how bad it is.
Good. I think the last question will come from over here.
Mark Watson, University of Oregon. I guess my big takeaway from Deanna's presentation is that not so much of a failure, to preserve materials, but maybe it's a failure of taking a top-down approach. And because when you look around, a lot has been done, and maybe we just don't need, to keep thinking that it's got to come from on high, and that some commission is going to succeed where so many have failed. When we were entranced by microfilm, did anybody imagine that a for-profit corporation could scan and digitize as many books as have been digitized? Haven't they shown us that digitization, we probably could digitize all these books and all these materials? I wouldn't have thought so before, but I think it's within the realm of possibility. And and hasn't something like West already shown us that we can preserve the print? Yes, it's complicated, but that program is succeeding. And bit by bit, we are actually storing copies of the original. So it seems like maybe the strategy is already in place. We can digitize it all, and we can save it all. And we're actually doing that, despite failures of top-down approaches in the past.
Thanks, Mark. Good. Okay, we're just on time for break at 2:30. We made a very good start, so take 15 minutes and pat yourself on the back, and we'll get back.